The time is at hand.
From the land of crackheads and honey on the south side of town, this is In Dark Places. I've been kind of rearranging the recording room here as if I didn't have enough distractions. I've got this keeping me busy now. You know how whenever you buy stuff, it's got like the Spanish translation on the box because there's so many illegal immigrants in America now? They'll have like the Spanish translation for cornflakes and stuff like that on the box. Jimmy bought a big, huge 7-foot tall werewolf animatronic thing to put out in his yard last year for Halloween. And on the box, whenever he was buying it, it said, "Hombre Loco." So the Spanish translation for werewolf is crazy man. I don't know, I got a big kick out of that. This week on the show, werewolves. The image of men turning into ravening wolves is one that has haunted men's minds for centuries. The terrifying legend of the werewolf is one of the most widespread in the world, but, asks Ian Woodward, is there more to it than superstition? Hey, thanks, Ian. Toward the middle of the 19th century, on a picturesque hill near the Vistula, a river in Poland that flows past Krakow and Warsaw, a large gathering of young people were celebrating with music, singing, and dancing the completion of the harvest. There was food and drink in abundance, and everyone indulged themselves freely. And then, while the merrymaking was in full swing, a terrible, blood-curdling cry echoed across the valley. Abandoning their dancing, the young men and women ran in the direction from which the cry came, and discovered, to their horror, that an enormous wolf had seized one of the village's prettiest girls, recently engaged to be married, and was dragging her away. Her fiancé was nowhere to be seen. The most courageous of men went in pursuit of the wolf and eventually confronted it. But the furious monster, with its mouth foaming with a fiendish rage, dropped its human prey on the ground and stood over it ready to fight. Some of the villagers ran home to fetch guns and axes, but the wolf, seeing the fear of those who remained, again seized the girl and vanished into the nearby forest. Many years elapsed, and then, at another harvest fest on the same hill, an old man approached the revelers. They invited him to join in the celebration, but the old man, gloomy and reserved, chose to sit down and drink in silence. A countryman of roughly the same age then joined him, and after looking at him closely for a moment or two, asked with some emotion, "Is that you, John?" The old man nodded, and instantly the countryman recognized the stranger as his elder brother, who had disappeared many years before. The merrymakers quickly gathered around the old visitor and listened to his strange tale. He told them how, having been changed into a wolf by a sorcerer, he had carried his fiancée away from that same hill during the harvest festival and had lived with her in a nearby forest for a year, after which she died. From that moment on, he continued, savage and furious, I attacked every man, woman, and child, and destroyed every animal I came across. My trail of bloodshed I cannot even now completely wipe away. At this point he showed them his hands, which were covered with bloodstains. It is some 4 years since, having once again changed back to human shape, I have wandered from place to place. I wanted to see you all once more, to see the cottage and the village where I was born and grew up to be a man. After that, well, I shall become a wolf again. No sooner than he had uttered those words than he changed into a wolf. He rushed past the astonished onlookers and disappeared into the forest. He was never seen again. The fairy tale aspects of this story make it very difficult to take seriously. Could too much drink have enhanced the already colorful imagination of the peasant folk? Could detail have been built upon detail with each new telling until it reached its present fanciful form? It is a strong possibility, and yet, like so many werewolf horror stories of this type, It is reported by many mythologists and historians, folklorists, and psychologists as pure fact. James Stallybrass, for instance, in Tintomic Mythology, John Fiske in Myths and Mythmakers from 1892, and Walter E. Kelly in Curiosities of Indo-European Tradition and Folklore from 1863. The profoundest problem for the serious student is simply that of trying to separate fact from balderdash. The introductory tale is a typical case in point. The origin of the werewolf superstition, the belief that a human being is capable of assuming an animal's form, most frequently that of a wolf, has never been satisfactorily explained. Herodotus, the Greek historian who lived in the 5th century BC, says that the Greeks and the Scythians, who settled on the shores of the Black Sea, regarded the native Nereians as wizards. They believed that these extraordinary magicians were transformed into wolves for a few days of every year. He speaks of a race of men who could change themselves at will into the shape of wolves and, when they desired, just as easily resume their original form. Craving for human flesh. In those early days, centuries before the birth of Christ, the demon werewolf was looked upon as a human being possessed by an unnatural craving for human flesh, who, by magical arts, had found a way to change at will into the form of a ravening wolf in order more readily to gratify this horrible appetite. Once transformed, the ancient sages believed the werewolf possessed the strength and cunning of the savage wolf beast, though retaining his human voice and his human eyes, by which alone he could be recognized. The transformation of men into wolves is known in Roman literature only as a work of magic. Virgil, writing in the 1st century BC, is the first Latin author to mention the superstition. He is followed by Propertius, Servius, and Petronius, the last of whom, director of entertainment at Nero's court from AD 54 to 68, tells a fine werewolf yarn in his satirical, picturesque romance, the Satyricon. Some of the Greek and Roman traditions represent the transformation of man into wolf as a punishment for sacrificing a human victim to a god. On such occasions, says Pliny, the victim was taken to the edge of a lake and, having swum to the far shore, changed into a wolf. In this condition, he roamed the countryside with fellow werewolves for a period of 9 years. If during this time he abstained from eating human flesh, he resumed his original form, which, however, had not been exempt from the ravages of increased age. Another mythological instance of werewolf shape-changing as a punishment for sin is recorded by Ovid in his narrative poem Metamorphosis. In it, Ovid recounts legends involving miraculous transformations of shape from the creation to the time of Julius Caesar. The Roman poet tells how Lycaon, mythical king of Arcadia, presumed to test the omniscience of Jupiter by placing before him a dish of human flesh, for which crime he was immediately transformed into a wolf to become forevermore a source of terror to his pastoral subjects. And even after Lycaon's time, according to a tradition recorded by Plato around the 4th century BC and by Pausanias in the 2nd century AD, similar transformations continued to occur on the same spot. The methods used by werewolves to effect their transformations differed widely. Sometimes the change was spontaneous and uncontrollable. Sometimes, as in the transformations described in the Norse and Icelandic sagas, it is achieved simply by assuming the skin of a real wolf. But in many cases, all that was needed was the use of a charm that, while involving no actual change in the human body, caused all onlookers to imagine that they really saw a wolf. Some of the transformed men claimed they could regain human form only by means of certain medicines or herbs such as aconite or hemlock, or by rubbing ointments on their bodies, as did Scandinavian and Central European werewolves from the 15th century onward. Witches and werewolves. We had a show by that title. So genuine was the belief in the werewolf transformation that in the 15th and 16th centuries, werewolves throughout Europe were regarded in the same light as witches and wizards, and anyone suspected of being a werewolf was burnt or hanged with the utmost cruelty, especially in France and Germany. As Elton B. McNeill explains in The Psychosis from 1970, commenting on this era of flagellantism or self-injury, tarantism or dancing mania, mass hysteria, hypochondriacal delusion, projection or hallucination, and werewolfism. Attitudes reflected a psychology influenced by the belief that whom the gods will destroy, they first make mad. Madness, as an expression of the will of God, became epidemic. Its cure became a religious ritual designed to use the psychotic as a target for religious persecution and as a mean of reaffirming the worth of the blessed, innocent, and pure. Blessed were those who exposed persons who had sold their souls to the devil. The classic hunt of witches was a side product in the search for salvation. The hunt for werewolves was a manifestation of much the same sort of religious feeling. Witch trials and werewolf trials are clearly interrelated. It is in witch-crazed France that the most numerous instances of werewolves are to be found. In one period of little over 100 years, between 1520 and 1630, France could record a staggering 30,000 cases of werewolfism, a fact documented in the proceedings of werewolf trials that are preserved in the public records. In 1573, at Douai, near Dijon, in central France, a werewolf named Gilles Garnier was accused of devastating the countryside and devouring little children, and, after confessing the crimes, was burnt at the stake. Some years later, in 1598, in a wild and desolate area near Calde, some French countrymen stumbled across the horribly mutilated, blood-splattered body of a 15-year-old boy. A pair of wolves, which had been devouring the corpse, ran off into a nearby thicket as the men approached. They gave chase, and almost immediately they found a half-naked man crouching in the bushes, sporting long hair and unkempt beard, and long, dirty claw-like nails, which were clotted with fresh blood and the shreds of human flesh. The man, Jacques Rollet, was a pathetic, half-witted specimen under the curse of a cannibal appetite. He was in the process of tearing to pieces the corpse of the boy when disturbed by the countrymen. Whether or not there were any wolves in the case, except what the excited imaginations of the men may have conjured up, it is impossible to determine. But it is certain that Rollet supposed himself to be a wolf and killed and ate several people under the influence of the delusion. He was sentenced to death, but the law courts of Paris reversed the sentence and charitably shut him up in a madhouse, an institution where most suspected werewolves should have lived out their days rather than being executed. Another significant werewolf case occurred in the early 17th century. Jean Garnier was a boy of 13, partially idiotic, and of strongly marked physiognomy. His jaws stuck forward, and his canine teeth showed under his upper lip. He believed himself to be a werewolf. One evening, meeting some young girls, he terrified them by telling them that as soon as the sun had set, he would turn into a wolf and eat them for supper. One little girl, having gone out at nightfall to tend to the sheep, was attacked by by some creature that in her terror she mistook for a wolf, but that afterward she proved to be none other than Jean Grenier. She beat him off with her sheep staff and fled home. When brought before the law courts of Bordeaux, he confessed that 2 years previously he had met the devil one night in the woods and had signed a compact with him and received from him a wolfskin. Since then he had roamed about as a wolf after dark, resuming his human shape by daylight. He had killed and eaten several children whom he had found alone in the fields, and once he entered a house while the family were out and taken a baby from its cradle. A careful investigation by the court proved that these statements were true, certainly as far as cannibalism was concerned. There is no doubt that the missing children were eaten by Jean Grenier, and there is no doubt that the half-witted boy was firmly convinced that he was a wolf. In more recent times, the werewolf phenomenon has retreated into the realms of a more subjective reality, but has done so without losing any of its grim horror. 3 werewolves were said to haunt the forested Ardennes area of Belgium just before the First World War, while in Scotland at about the same time a hermit shepherd in Inverness Shire was rumored to be a werewolf. In 1925, a whole village near Strasbourg testified that a local boy was a werewolf, and 5 years later a French werewolf scare terrorized Bourg-la-Reine in an incident related by Pierre von Pausen in his book Days of Our Years from 1939. In America in 1946, a Navajo Indian reservation was frequently plagued by a murderous beast that was widely reported as a werewolf. Navajo traditions are rich in werewolf tales. 3 years later in Rome, a police patrol was sent to investigate the strange behavior of a man suffering from werewolf delusions. He regularly lost control at full moon and let out loud and terrifying howls. In Singapore in 1957, police were again called to look into what the authorities believed was a long series of werewolf attacks on the residents of a particular nurse's hostel on the main island. One nurse awoke to find a horrible face with hair reaching to the bridge of his nose and long protruding fangs glaring down at her. The mystery has never been solved, nor was the case of the 16-year-old schoolgirl at Rosario do Sul in southern Brazil, who in 1978 suffered terrible evil visions and demons, and who believed she was taken over by the spirit of a savage wolf. In 1975, Britain's newspapers were full of extraordinary reports about a 17-year-old youth from the village of Eccleshall, Staffordshire, who, in the awful belief that he was turning into a werewolf, terminated his mental agonies by plunging a flick knife into his heart. One of his workmates told the inquest jury that the youth had made a frantic telephone call just before his death. "He told me," said the witness, "that his face and hands were changing color, and that he was changing into a werewolf. He would go quiet and then start growling." The werewolf traditions may be built on ignorance and delusion, but its influence on the minds of the weak and the sick has always been powerful. A change for the worse. Why is it that so many werewolf stories stem from medieval times? One theory suggests that the fact cannot be explained away by pointing to the superstitious nature of the medieval mind. Biochemically induced hallucinations may have been almost everyday experiences for many people. Extracts from the skins of toads and plants such as mandrake, henbane, and deadly nightshade, or belladonna, were frequently used by practitioners of the secret arts to induce sensations of flying or the delusion of growing claws and nails or turning into an animal. But such hallucinations were not available only to people who chose to take these drugs. In medieval meals, grain was sorted into 2 heaps: clean grain for the aristocrats and clergy, and organized grain for the peasants. Organized grain carries a fungus that produces lysergic acid, dilithiamide, a drug similar to LSD that also produces the illusion of being turned into an animal. Thus, almost anyone at any time could suddenly feel himself turning into a werewolf. Delusions and transformations. History abounds with stories of people who claim to be werewolves and behave in a savage and bestial way, and yet keep their human shape. This form of madness still occurs today. Ian Woodward seeks an explanation. Thanks, Ian. Most people's conception of a werewolf is an excessively hairy and ferocious man-beast that walks upright on two legs, growls, and foams at the mouth, and displays large, dirty-looking lupine teeth. This, of course, is the now familiar portrait represented at late-night television movies like Curse of the Werewolf, The Wolfman, and Legend of the Werewolf, and it is inaccurate in all essentials. History and mythology are quite clear in describing a man transformed into a werewolf as being little different from a natural wolf, except perhaps slightly larger than the wild species. Those unfamiliar with the subject also tend to bracket werewolves with lycanthropes. A lycanthrope is a mentally sick person who believes that he has assumed the shape, voice, and behavior of a wolf, although he has not actually undergone any physical transformation. In the 15th and 16th centuries, it was believed that the werewolf's fur grew on the inside of its skin, and many a lycanthrope has given this explanation when asked why. If he is a wolf, he still looks exactly like a person. A werewolf, on the other hand, is traditionally a man who, by the agency of magic or by natural inclination, possesses an ability to change his shape to that of a wolf. All the characteristics associated with the animal, the ferocity, strength, cunning, and swiftness, are readily displayed to the dumbfounded horror of all whose path he crosses. He may remain in his animal form for a few hours or even permanently. When Peter Stump, a notorious German werewolf who died a terrible death near Cologne in 1589, confessed to magical self-transformation, we may be inclined to think him as fantastical as his judges were credulous. But having killed, mutilated, and devoured hundreds of human and animal victims, though he admitted to only 16 people, while convinced he was, to all intents and purposes, a wolf, we can be in no doubt at all that he was suffering from the madness called lycanthropy. Lycanthropy.
Lycanthropy.
Lycanthropy? Oh yeah. Lycanthropy and lycanthrope derive directly from the Greek word lykos, although lycanthropy originally referred to an ancient phenomenon of men capable of undergoing animal metamorphosis, a phenomenon fervently believed in by such ancient Greek physicians as Krabosios and Aetios. It gradually became a term applied exclusively to men who imagined they had effected transformation into beasts. For this reason, lycanthropy is looked upon by psychiatrists as a fundamental delusion. As for the werewolf proper, two qualities were said to remain when a man was transformed into a wolf: his human voice and his eyes. But in all other respects, the metamorphosized werewolf was essentially animal. He had the hair, skin, and claws of a wild wolf. In his human form, however, a number of physical characteristics distinguished the werewolf from his fellow men. His eyebrows were said to meet on the bridge of the nose, and his long, almond-shaped fingernails were of a sickening blood-red tinge. The third finger, in particular, was always very long. The ears, which were positioned low down and to the back of the head, and a tendency toward hairiness of the hands and feet, were also clear identifying marks. There are traditionally three types of werewolf. The first was the hereditary werewolf. His involuntarily malady was passed down from one generation to another as a consequence of some terrible family curse. The second was the voluntary werewolf. His depravity of mind led him by choice to the realms of black magic ritual. into the use of all manner of terrible charms, potions, ointments, girdles, animal skins, and devil worship incantations to bring about the desired metamorphosis. And the third was the benevolent werewolf. This gentle, protective scion of the werewolf family is almost a contradiction in terms. He felt nothing but shame for his brutal appearance and wished that no harm should befall man or animal. Two of the most familiar benevolent werewolves are depicted in a fine pair of 12th century romances, William and the Werewolf by Guillaume de Paulin and Marie de Francis Lay of the Disclaverant, and that is a term for werewolf. About one of Brittany's gallant knights. The medieval theory was that while the werewolf kept his human form, his hair grew inward. When he wished to become a wolf, he simply turned himself inside out. An examination of many verbatim trial documents reveals that the prisoners, undoubtedly lycanthropes, were painstakingly questioned in a bid to discover the secrets of animal metamorphosis. When such interrogation failed and the patience of the judges ran out, some wretched victim would invariably have his arms and legs cut off, or be partly flayed in an attempt to find the reputed inward-growing hair. Haunters of shadowy woods. Another theory was that the possessed person had merely to put on a wolf skin in order to assume instantly the Lapan form and character. There is a vague similarity here with the alleged fact that the berserker, the Scandinavian bear-man, or werebear, haunted the shadowy woods at night, clothed in the hides of wolves or bears to acquire superhuman strength by transformation. Such a wolfskin was kept by the werewolf boy Jean Grenier. Jacques Roulet, on the other hand, confessed to using a magic salve or ointment, as he admitted in court on August 8th, 1598. "What are you accused of having done?" asked the judge. "Of having offended God," replied the 35-year-old accused werewolf. "My parents gave me an ointment. I do not know its composition." And the judge asked, "When rubbed with this ointment, do you become a wolf?" "No," Roulet replied. "But for all that, I killed and ate the child Cornier. I was a wolf." "Were you dressed as a wolf?" "I was dressed as I am now. I had my hands and my face bloody because I had been eating the flesh of the said child." "Do your hands and feet become the paws of a wolf?" "Yes, they do." "Does your head become like that of a wolf?" "Your head become larger?" "I do not know how my head was at the time. I used my teeth. My head was as it is today. I have wounded and eaten many other little children." A further method of becoming a werewolf was to obtain a girdle, usually of animal origin, but occasionally made from the skin of a hanged man. Such a girdle was fastened with a bucket having 7 tongues. When the bucket was unclasped, or the girdle cut, the charm was dissolved. One account tells of a 16th century sorcerer who possessed such a girdle. One day he went out away from the house for a few hours without remembering to lock up the girdle. His young son subsequently climbed up to the cupboard to get it, and as he was buckling it around his waist, he was instantly transformed into a strange-looking beast. At this point his father returned home, and on seizing the girdle, restored the child to his former natural shape. It is said that the boy confessed no sooner had he buckled the girdle than he was tormented by a fierce hunger and a bestial rage, but it seems more likely that, being of a susceptible age, he had heard his father boast of the girdle's magical qualities, and was determined to experience them for himself. Eliphas Levi, the leading French occultist of the 19th century, who once collapsed in a terror as a result of his own remarkable transcendental magic, has explained the process of werewolfic transformation as a sympathetic condition between man and his animal presentment form. He rightly notes in History of Magic from 1860 that werewolves, though tracked down, hunted, and even maimed, have never been killed on the spot, and the people suspected of these atrocious self-transformations have always been found at home after the pursuit of the werewolf, more or less wounded, sometimes dying, but in their natural form. Savage instincts. Levi then goes on to discuss the phenomenon of man's sidereal body, the mediator between the soul and the material organism, and uses it as the basis of an explanation of werewolfism. The body remains awake very often while the other is asleep, and by thought transports itself through all space, which universal magnetism opens up. It thus lengthens without breaking. The sympathetic chain attaches it to the heart and brain. The form of our sidereal body is comfortable to the habitual condition of our thoughts, and in the long run, it is bound to modify the features of the material organism. Levi proceeds to suggest that the werewolf is nothing more than the sidereal body of a man whose savage instincts are represented by the wolf, who, while his phantom is wandering abroad, dreams that he is nothing less than a savage wolf. Certainly, theosophists of today believe that during the Middle Ages, when public execution was common, many people sank so low morally that their astral bodies, the human spirits that we are said to use after death, actually linked with an animal. This explains why, if the astral body were to manifest itself in the form of a wolf, and it were subsequently wounded, as Paul cut off, say, by a hunter, that would probably be duplicated on the werewolf's physical body in its human form. That is, one of the hands would be badly wounded or missing when the werewolf reverted to his human state. Charles Webster Leadbeater, an Anglican clergyman, lived at the turn of the century and became one of the principal figures of the Theosophical Society, substantiates with great enthusiasm the theory of wound doubling in his book The Astral Plane from 1895. As so often with ordinary materialization, any wound inflicted upon the animal will be reproduced upon the human physical body by the extraordinary phenomenon or repercussion, though after the death of that physical body, the astral, which will probably continue to appear in the same form, will be less vulnerable. It will then, however, be also less dangerous, as, unless it can find a suitable medium, it will be unable to materialize fully. The phenomenon of wound doubling through the agency of astral projection is certainly a theory that is gaining considerable ground among many of today's spiritual thinkers. Rose Gladden, one of Britain's most experienced exorcists and a renowned clairvoyant healer, has no doubt that the diabolical application of astral projection played a key role in the lives of many accused werewolves. She explains, "Suppose I was a cruel person who enjoyed the horrible things in life. Well, as I projected my astral body out of my physical body, all the surrounding evil could grasp me, and it would be the evil grasping my astral projection, or grasping my double, which would transform me into an animal, into a wolf. The atmosphere is always full of evil forces, and these evil forces find it much easier to exist within mankind, within an evil man, say, than in a nebulous vacuum. People addicted to werewolfery were indeed, still are, the most evil manifestations of humanity. I can well understand why there are so many instances on records of wound doubling. A strange restlessness. Among the countless numbers of wound doubling reports on historical record is one concerning a German farmer and his wife who were haymaking near Kausberg in the summer of 1721. After a while, the wife said that she felt an unconquerable restlessness. She could not remain there 1 minute longer. After making her husband promise that if any wild animal came nearer, he would throw his hat at it and run away, she quickly disappeared. But she had not been gone many seconds when a wolf was seen to be swimming across the nearby stream and headed for the haymakers. The farmer threw his hat at the beast, which tore it to bits. But before he could make a hasty retreat, a man stole around with a pitchfork and stabbed the wolf to death. The beast's form changed instantly, and everyone was horrified to see that the man had slain the farmer's wife. Whether fact or fantasy, killing a werewolf in this way has always, by tradition, been the most favored means by which to force him or her to resume his natural form on the spot or lead to his speedy detection. But the bizarre episodes of wound doubling often reported in werewolf cases are also common in out-of-body experiences. Could it be that this remarkable fact points toward a possible explanation of the werewolf superstition, astral projection? Is a werewolf no more than a manifestation of the sidereal body, spoken of by Eliphas Levi, a man's projected phantom? The werewolf sickness. Many of the werewolves of the past have been explained away as mad or as sufferers from diseases such as rabies. But, argues Ian Woodward, this does not dispose of the nagging question, do werewolves really exist? Thanks, Ian. Although the ancient Greeks and Romans, and to some extent the ancient Arabs, believed in the occasional localized existence of werewolfism, the situation was quite different in the Middle Ages in Europe. At this time, the process of man into beast was supposed to be a phenomenon of daily occurrence. And even today, in remote regions of Europe and Scandinavia, the superstition has not entirely lost its old power to grip the imagination of simple country folk. But superstition is the religion of feeble minds, as the 18th century British statesman Edmund Burke observed in another context, and it is certainly the very lifeblood of the werewolf legend. Though doubtless purely mythical in its origin, it nonetheless presents in its developed state a curious mixture of mythical, historical, demonical, and psychological elements. Modern science finds in werewolfism little that can be readily explained, and much that cannot be explained satisfactorily. The superstition, stemming from a period of 1,000 years before Christianity, contains a great deal that cannot be rationalized by modern thought. Man's social development has for many centuries been strengthening those benevolent feelings that distinguish us from animals. Our primitive bestial impulses are consequently dying for want of exercise or being suppressed by stringent laws of the land. But this process, which transforms us from primitive savage into so-called civilized people, is a very slow one. And now and then, there occur cases of what psychologists call avatism, or reversion to an ancestral or primitive type of character. From time to time, in civilized countries, people are born possessed of bestial appetites and cravings, a delight in fiendish cruelty, and a liking for human flesh. Modern psychology knows how to classify and explain these abnormal cases, but to the unscientific, highly susceptible medieval mind, they went inexplicable only as the works of the devil. So perhaps there is nothing strange in the fact that, in an age when the prevailing thought rendered the transformation of men into werewolves as an easily admissible notion, these monsters of cruelty and depraved appetite should have been regarded as capable of taking on bestial forms. As civilization advances, so one by one, the animal horror myths disappear with the animals that gave rise to them. The Sioux Indians of North Dakota, for instance, once believed very strongly in the appearance of a monstrous animal that swallowed human beings. The Sioux today, however, think very differently, for having forgotten their ancient mythology, they now realize that the superstition was suggested by nothing more terrifying than the bones of prehistoric mastodons, which are often found in the North Dakota plains. The starting point of the werewolf superstition, as we have seen, is the habit of members of primitive societies of disguising themselves as animals when roaming the countryside as foragers or scouts. Like wolves, they wandered in search of food. It is easy to see how reports would often represent them as possessing in their disguise all the ferocious qualities of the animal they impersonated, and finally, even of actually taking on animal form, either wholly or in part, for longer or shorter periods of time. Some of the North American Indian werewolf stories represent men as having only the head, hands, and feet of a wolf. The werewolf transformation in France, Germany, Scandinavia, and some East European countries is caused by a shirt or girdle made of wolfskin, a survival of the robe or mantle originally disguising the entire body. Delusion, insanity. In the early part of the 17th century, when the French werewolf boy Jean Grenier was put on trial for the murder of several children, the court displayed a depth of compassion unusual for the period. It took into account both the boy's tender age, he was 13, and medical opinion, which was that Grenier was a victim of delusional insanity or lycanthropy. And so he was dispatched not to the flames of the stake, but to a term of life imprisonment within the walls of the Franciscan monastery in Bordeaux. The idea of a werewolf being the victim of insanity was by no means new. A few years earlier, 14 people tried in France for sorcery and werewolf transformations were subsequently acquitted. But Grenier's case does mark the beginning of a significant new approach to werewolfism. Judges, finding it difficult to ignore any longer the mounting outcry of the doctors, were themselves becoming more and more convinced that many suspected werewolves were in fact patients suffering from various forms of mental delusion, a form of madness, not helped by the potent drugs and incantations with which many of these patients indulged themselves. It was from this time that men of law and medicine started to subdivide people with animal delusions into two quite distinct categories: werewolf and lycanthropes. The werewolf was the mythical creature, the lycanthrope the mental patient. All over Europe, scholars were applying new definitions to the malady. The great English clergyman scholar Robert Burton, in his classic medical treatise, The Anatomy of Melancholy, from 1621, called it quite simply wolf madness, which men run howling about graves and fields in the night, and will not be persuaded but that they are wolves. In the 17th century, Alfonso Ponce de Santa Cruz, physician to Spain's Philip XI, put the illness down to a symptom of melancholic humor, a product of the bile that medieval doctors believed attacks the brain. Modern doctors regard the delusional aspects of lycanthropy as psychological in origin. The world history of psychiatry explained that hypochondria could sometimes develop into lycanthropy, and give a disturbing contemporary account for a 30-year-old patient who first fell into a melancholy and then developed a monomania, which made him believe that he was transformed into a wolf. Lycanthropy. He had fled from men and sought refuge in the mountains, where he spent the nights howling, visiting the graveyard, and invoking the dead. It is not difficult to imagine how such prisoners of delusional insanity in the less enlightened 17th century could be persuaded to confess with very little trouble to stories of bloodshed and werewolf metamorphosis. That thousands of people have been executed because of the popular belief in werewolves is a matter of common fact. Court records tell us as much. But it is yet an instance of the fatal ease with which superstition has turned disease itself. Here, a clear case of lycanthropy into food for its love of cruelty. It is also a monument to pure ignorance. But to return to more recent matters, in his classic book on sadism, masochism, and lycanthropy, Man into Wolf from 1951, the British anthropologist Dr. Robert Eisler makes the fascinating observation that Adolf Hitler may have suffered from the disease of lycanthropy. Dr. Eisler refers to the now legendary eyewitness accounts of the Führer biting the carpet in his fits of rage. If the stories about Hitler's rages are true, explains the doctor, they would appear to have been manic lycanthropic states. Cruel murder and the werewolf. The American psychoanalyst Dr. Nandor Fodder interprets lycanthropy not so much as a psychological condition, but as a psychic mechanism. Dr. Fodder attaches great importance to dreams, especially those in which transformation, bloodshed, cruel murder, and the werewolf form an integral part. His interpretation of such lycanthropic dreams became the subject of several books and of an important paper published in the Journal of American Folklore in 1945. Here is one example from his casebook. A London woman wakes in the morning to find two gleaming eyes in the head of a wolf-shaped animal glaring at her from near the fireplace. In terror, she switches on the light, whereupon the animal vanishes. She believes it was a werewolf. On being asked for associations, Wolf becomes the name of a man through whom she had lost a lot of money and who had climbed into her bedroom in France at night and threatened to strangle her if she would not leave her husband and be his. By his brown, large, and baleful eyes, he qualified for the werewolf. Only the werewolf vision took place before the man invaded the lady's bedroom. Nevertheless, the association gives us a clue to the understanding of her hypnopompic hallucination. It represents her sadistic expectations. The glare in the eye of the wolf was the glow of her own desire for assault, and the fireplace was a fitting topographical symbol for the passion with which she burned. Lycanthropy and werewolfism clearly form a complex subject, littered with numerous booby traps, and to comprehend it fully, one should consider such matters as black magic, cannibalism, insanity, low intelligence, gullibility, sadism, inebriation, susceptibility, fantasy, astral projection, and rabies. Ancient medicine could easily have confused the lycanthropic form of psychosis with contagious canine rabies, communicable to dogs by the bite of wolves and to man by the bite of a dog, which causes man and dog to snap and bite everything within reach, and so to spread the terrible disease. For thousands of years, the principal factor in recognizing a werewolf was by the frothing at the mouth, a symptom that also identifies the human rabid patient. So was the Roman poet Ovid when referring to Lycon's transformation into a wolf. In fact, basing his description on either a rabid wolf or a rabid man. He says of Lycon, "In vain he attempted to speak. From that very instant, his jaws were besplattered with foam, and only he thirsted for blood as he raged among flocks and painted for slaughter." It's not a very good poem. It doesn't even rhyme. Ovid is talking, in fact, about a werewolf. Being bitten by a werewolf, tradition has it, will make the victim a werewolf, and being bitten by a rabid wolf will make the victim rabid. Imagine the dilemma of the rustic mind, for whom a rabid wolf was quite simply a raging werewolf, and imagine his terror if he was subsequently attacked by the diseased animal and developed all the symptoms of rabies. To observers, he was a werewolf. So werewolves may be interpreted as people suffering from a terrible disease, delusional as well as contagious, or the belief in them could be the result of continuing superstitions dating back to primitive cultures and based in fact. One plausible explanation involves dreams, for if a mentally unbalanced person frequently dreamed that he was a wolf, Might he not one day become convinced that he really was one? There are scientists today who have not completely rejected the possibility that werewolves may have existed, for it is really reasonable to suppose that legend, if it has no factual basis, can survive on fantasy alone. If it is so much nonsense, this perennial belief in animal metamorphosis, why should learned men of science and medicine in all ages have spent so much time studying it? It seems we're all out of stories for this episode. What do you think? Werewolves, myth or reality? I like me some werewolf stories. That's cool. Thanks as always, Jimmy Haunted, for teaching me how to say lycanthropy. Thank you for listening. If you got a scary story and you'd like to be a guest on the show, send an email to indarkplacespod@hotmail.com. We'll see you again next time. God bless.